Have you ever wondered how a single skill, something simple like sewing, could become the lifeline that holds a family together? In a world where most people overlook small talents, one young woman discovered that her stitches were more than fabric and thread. They were survival. They were hope. They were the silent promise of a future she refused to lose. She grew up in a one-bedroom apartment on the edge of the city, the kind of place where walls were thin and bills always came before food. Her father had left early, and her mother, weakened by chronic illness, struggled to keep the lights on. Most nights, the apartment buzzed with tension, the hum of unpaid utilities, the whisper of hunger, the sound of her own heart beating too fast. In the corner of that small room stood an old, second-hand sewing machine, rusty at the edges, with a pedal that squeaked like a bird in pain. It had belonged to her grandmother. For years, it was just another piece of furniture, until the day everything changed. She was 12 when she first sat at that machine. Her mother was too weak to sew a neighbor's repair order, so she whispered, "Try it yourself." Her hands shook as she threaded the needle, the thread breaking again and again under her nervous fingers. But she tried and tried and tried. And when the needle finally sank into the cloth, it was as if a door had opened. The rhythmic sound of the pedal, the vibration of the machine, the sight of two pieces of fabric becoming one, it was magic. That day, she learned her first stitch. That day, she learned she could fix what was torn. Soon, sewing became more than a skill. It became her language. With every hem she fixed, she bought a little rice. With every patch she sewed, she bought medicine for her mother. With every curtain she mended, she felt a small rise of pride in a world that mostly ignored her. There were days she sewed until her fingers bled. The skin on her palms hardened from pressing fabric against the needle plate. Days when schoolwork waited untouched because survival came first. Days when she whispered to herself, "If I don't do it, nobody will." Still, under the harsh fluorescent light of that cramped room, she began to stitch not only fabric, but her own future. Each line of thread was a quiet rebellion, each seam a secret plan. Sewing was no longer just a way to survive, it was becoming a map to something more. She started sketching designs in the margins of her school notebooks, dresses she would make one day, fabrics she couldn't afford but imagined anyway. Each time she pressed the pedal of that old machine, she pictured herself in a bigger space, with sunlight streaming across bolts of fabric, with customers waiting for her creations. These weren't just daydreams, they were blueprints. They were her daily motivation, her escape hatch, her hope. Her mornings started before sunrise, packing her mother's medications and a small lunch. Her afternoons were filled with school and quick jobs for neighbors. Her evenings belonged to the sewing machine, the rhythm of needle and thread keeping her awake when everything else wanted to pull her down. By the time she was 18, she had become the neighborhood's go-to seamstress. But the larger world wasn't so welcoming. Boutiques rejected her designs without looking at them. Local tailors undercut her prices. Factories offered mass production at costs she couldn't compete with. Money was always tight. Her mother's condition worsened, and medical bills began to consume everything she earned. One afternoon, after a particularly humiliating rejection from a boutique, she came home and sat silently at the machine. She stared at the thread, at her hands, at the walls closing in. She felt small, invisible, tired. But she also knew this. Every skill she had taught herself. Every client she had won on her own. Every obstacle she had survived had made her stronger. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and whispered, "I'm not finished." It came in the form of a wedding dress, A distant acquaintance had seen her work and asked if she could make a gown, not just alter one, but create it from scratch. The payment wasn't much, but the opportunity was enormous. She worked like never before. Every detail, every seam, every hidden stitch carried the weight of her family's survival and her own self-belief. When the bride finally tried on the gown, she cried, not because it was perfect, but because it was hers. That dress became her calling card. Photos spread, neighbors talked, and for the first time, orders came not for alterations, but for original pieces. It was still small, still fragile, but it was a spark, and sparks can start fires. With the income from the wedding dress and a few other orders, she saved enough to buy a newer machine. It wasn't brand new, but it was smoother, faster, and quieter, a small luxury that felt like a victory. She rented a corner of a friend's garage to serve as a tiny workshop. No sign, no storefront, just bolts of fabric stacked against walls and a small desk where she kept her records. She began studying business basics online late at night, learning about pricing, customer service, and branding. She realized she didn't just want to sew clothes, she wanted to build a brand. It was exhausting. She balanced customer orders, caregiving for her mother, and relentless learning. But she could feel something shifting. For the first time, she was not only surviving, she was building. Then came the moment she had feared. She couldn't keep up with the orders alone. The waiting list stretched longer. Customers asked for quicker delivery. Yet the thought of hiring someone terrified her. She lay awake at night calculating on scraps of paper whether she could afford to pay another pair of hands. What if the orders slowed down? What if she couldn't meet payroll? What if everything collapsed and she dragged another woman into her failure? For weeks she wrestled with the decision. Her mother told her, "You can't do everything alone." But the fear of promising wages she couldn't guarantee weighed like a stone. She remembered the days when a single unpaid bill could cut off their electricity. The idea of being responsible for someone else's survival made her chest tighten. Finally, one dawn, after another sleepless night, she decided to risk it. She hired a young woman from the neighborhood, a girl with the same hunger in her eyes she once had. The first week, she barely slept, worrying about covering expenses. She skipped meals to make sure she had enough for fabric and wages. But slowly, with 2 sets of hands, production doubled. Orders were delivered on time. Clients spread the word. Soon, she hired another woman, then another. Her tiny workshop became a living room of machines and chatter. There was laughter between the hum of sewing, shared lunches on the floor, advice traded over fabric scraps. In teaching them, she taught herself to trust. In lifting them, she lifted herself. Years passed. Her small corner garage became a modest studio, then a real storefront with a sign carrying her name. Fashion magazines took notice. Local newspapers wrote about her story. Her brand grew, but more importantly, so did her sense of purpose. She was no longer simply sewing garments. She was crafting opportunities, rewriting narratives, showing that a girl from a 1-bedroom apartment with a rusty sewing machine could stand shoulder to shoulder with established designers. At her mother's bedside, now improved but still fragile, she held the first copy of her business license. "I did it." And her mother, eyes glistening, said, "We did it." Her story is not just about fashion or business, it's about persistence, discipline, and the courage to keep stitching even when the fabric tears. You don't need perfect conditions to start. You don't need approval to grow. You don't need to know the entire pattern before you begin. You start with one stitch, then another, and before you know it, you've built something strong enough to hold a dream. Her journey from seamstress to entrepreneur is a reminder: no matter how small the room, no matter how rusty the machine, no matter how heavy the obstacles, a single thread of determination can hold a whole future together.